The wallet was sitting on the edge of the sink when I found it. Not on the counter, not near the door, on the edge of the sink, like someone had set it down in a hurry and walked away without thinking. The men's restroom at Harlow's had a lounge area right outside it, one of those strange architectural quirks of old Chicago buildings, where the hallway bent at an odd angle, and the restrooms were tucked behind a velvet curtain, like an afterthought. I'd taken a wrong turn. The sign had been partially blocked by a flower arrangement that was too tall for the space, white orchids spilling over the brass letters, and by the time I realized I'd pushed open the wrong door, I was already 2 steps inside. I backed out immediately, obviously. But I'd seen it. Black leather, thick, no logo, just sitting there. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my back against the wallpaper, deep burgundy, gold thread. And I told myself it wasn't my problem. I was already late returning to table 12. The Harrington anniversary party had been running since 6, and my manager, David, had that particular look on his face all evening, the one that meant one more mistake, and we're having a conversation Monday morning. I'd already spilled a drop of red wine on the tablecloth at table 7. Just one drop, barely visible, but David had seen it. I should have walked away from the wallet. Instead, I went back in, grabbed it without opening it, and walked straight to the host stand. Found this in the men's lounge, I told Marcus, who was working the front that night. He barely looked up. Lost and found is in the back office. Can you take it? I have a table. So do I. He finally glanced at me. Back office, Scarlett. End of the hall, past the wine storage. I went. Of course I went. That's the thing about me. I always go. My mother used to say I had a compulsion to fix things that weren't mine to fix, and she wasn't wrong. She was just saying it like it was a flaw. I dropped the wallet on the desk in the back office, noted the time, 8:47 p.m., and rushed back to the floor. I didn't think about it again for the rest of the night. The shift ended at 11:30. I changed out of my work clothes in the staff room, pulling on my jeans and the green jacket I'd had since college, the one with the slightly frayed left cuff that I kept meaning to replace. Outside, Chicago in late October had that particular cruelty to it. Not fully winter yet, but cold enough to mean it. The wind off the lake cut sideways down the street, and I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking toward the L station 4 blocks east. I was halfway down the 2nd block when someone said my name. Not loudly. Not like a shout across the street. Quietly, from very close, like whoever said it had simply appeared beside me without sound. I stopped. There were 2 men, both in dark coats, both built like they were paid to stand in front of things. One of them, the one on my left, was looking straight ahead, not at me. The other one, closer, said, "Miss Scarlett, Mr. Kyungsoo would like a word." My first thought was that I'd misheard. My second thought was that I should run. I didn't do either. "I don't know anyone by that name," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. "The wallet you returned tonight." The man's tone was flat, informational, like he was reading from a script that required no emotion. "It belongs to him." I looked past them. There was a black car idling at the curb, a car so dark and so silent it seemed to absorb the light from the street lamp rather than reflect it. The windows were tinted. The engine made almost no sound. "I just turned it in at the host stand," I said. "I didn't open it. I didn't take anything." He knows. A pause. "He'd like to thank you in person." Every reasonable instinct I had was telling me to say no, to say that's really not necessary and keep walking, because men who send other men to retrieve women off nighttime streets are not men who owe simple gratitude. I knew that. I'm not naive. I grew up on the South Side. I'd waited tables for 6 years in 4 different restaurants, and I'd learned to read rooms and read people, and everything about this moment was reading wrong. But then the back door of the car opened, and the light from inside was warm, almost amber, and I could see just enough to know that whoever was in there was watching me make my decision. I got in the car. He was younger than I expected. That was the first thing. I don't know what I'd built in my head in the 4 seconds between the door opening and me sliding into the seat. Some version of older, harder, the kind of man whose age is written in his eyes even when his face is still. But Kyungsoo wasn't that. He looked like he was in his early 30s, maybe. Dark hair pushed back from his face, sharp jaw, and a stillness about him that had nothing to do with relaxation. He was wearing a black suit, white shirt open at the collar, and I could see the edge of a tattoo climbing his neck. Intricate, dark lines disappearing beneath the fabric. He didn't speak first. Neither did I, because the air in that car had a weight to it, and I felt suddenly, acutely aware of how I was sitting, how I was breathing, how my jacket's frayed cuff was visible against my knee. Small things. Stupid things to notice. But that's what happens when someone looks at you the way he was looking at me. Not aggressively, not hungrily, just with complete, unhurried attention, like he had already decided you were worth studying. "You found my wallet," he said. Finally. His English was precise, slightly formal, the way people speak when a language is learned rather than absorbed from birth. "Yes," I said. "In the men's restroom. I took a wrong turn. The sign was blocked." I didn't know why I felt the need to explain. I picked it up and turned it in, that's all. He nodded once, slowly, like he was filing the information somewhere specific. "You didn't look inside." It wasn't quite a question. I held his gaze, and I want to be honest about how much effort that took, because his eyes were very dark and very direct, and looking into them felt less like making eye contact, and more like being assessed by something that didn't need to look away to remember every detail of what it had seen. "No," I said. "It wasn't mine to open." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a slight softening around the eyes. A fractional change that on another face might have meant nothing but on his felt significant, like a door opening half an inch. "Most people would have looked," he said. "I'm not most people." The words came out before I thought about them, and I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck because it sounded like posturing, like I was trying to impress him, which I absolutely was not. I was just tired from a 10-hour shift and operating on autopilot, and apparently my autopilot had no filter. But he didn't react to it the way I expected. He didn't smirk. He didn't lean back with that particular male satisfaction of someone who thinks he's just gotten a measure of you. He just kept looking at me. And after a moment, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the wallet. My wallet. The one I'd turned in, somehow already back in his possession, and set it on the seat between us. "There's something inside that I'd like you to take," he said. I looked at the wallet. I looked at him. "I don't want anything," I said. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know." His voice didn't change. "Take it anyway." The wallet was open now, though I hadn't seen him open it. There was a card inside, plain white, thick stock, just a number printed in small black digits. No name, no other information. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call that number." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the alternative was to sit there and fully absorb the absurdity of the situation. Me, in a blacked-out car, being handed a contact card by someone whose name I'd learned 4 minutes ago from a man on a sidewalk who'd appeared from nowhere. "I won't need anything," I said. "No," he agreed, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew that. "But take it." I took the card. I don't know why. I tucked it into my jacket pocket, next to my phone, and told myself it would go in the trash when I got home. The car stopped. I hadn't noticed it moving, but when I looked out the window, I was in front of my building. Not the L station, not somewhere generic. My actual building on West Cullerton. The one with the green door and the busted buzzer for apartment 4C that I'd been meaning to report to the landlord for 3 months. The chill that went through me had nothing to do with the October cold. "Good night, Scarlett," Kyungsoo said. I got out of the car without answering. I walked to my door without looking back. I told myself the sound of the car pulling away was just traffic, just the normal sounds of the city at midnight, and I went upstairs and stood in my kitchen for a long time before I remembered to take off my jacket. The card was still in the pocket. I didn't throw it away. I told myself I'd forgotten about it by Sunday. That's what I told myself, that the card was somewhere at the bottom of my jacket pocket, buried under a receipt from the pharmacy, and probably a lip balm I'd been looking for since September, and that I hadn't thought about it once since that night. That I hadn't taken the jacket off the hook by my door and held it in my hands on Friday morning, feeling the slight stiffness of the cardstock through the fabric. That I hadn't, on Saturday afternoon while folding laundry, picked up the jacket specifically to check that the card was still there. I told myself these things. I'm not sure I believed them. Monday came with a double shift and the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes, and I was grateful for it. Harlow's was busy, a private corporate dinner in the back room, 2 large parties on the main floor, and David in full management mode, moving through the space with a clipboard and an expression that dared anyone to make a mistake in his presence. I kept my head down. I refilled water glasses and carried plates and said, "Enjoy your evening," with the precise warmth that the job required, and I didn't think about black cars or dark wallets or a number on a plain white card. I almost managed it too. It was around 9:15 when Marcus caught me near the service station and said, low and sideways, "Table 4 asked for you specifically." I looked over. Table 4 was in the front section, near the window, not my section. Candlelight, 2 place settings, only 1 person seated. A man in a dark suit. Even from across the room, even with the restaurant noise and the movement of other servers between us, I recognized the stillness. "That's not my table," I said. David reassigned it. Marcus gave me a look that communicated clearly he wanted no part of whatever this was. He said the guest requested you by name. My stomach did something unpleasant. I smoothed my apron. I walked over. Kyungsoo looked up when I was still 3 steps away, like he'd been aware of my approach from the moment I'd moved. Up close, in the warm lighting of the restaurant, he looked different from how I'd seen him in the car. Less like a shadow, more like a person. Still immaculate. Still that particular quality of stillness. But his jacket was off, folded over the back of the empty chair across from him, and his sleeves were pushed up slightly at the wrist, and somehow that small informality made everything feel more unsettling, not less. "I didn't know you were coming," I said. I hadn't meant to open with that. It sounded accusatory. "I wanted dinner," he said simply. "There are other restaurants." "There are." He looked at me with that same unhurried directness. "I like this one." I took his order. Lamb chops, medium rare. Sparkling water, no ice. He didn't look at the menu for more than 30 seconds, like he'd already decided before arriving, which I suspected he had. I went through the motions, the kitchen, the other tables, the mechanical rhythm of the work. And every time I crossed the floor, I was aware of where he was without looking. The way you're aware of a heat source in a cold room. He ate slowly. He didn't look at his phone. He watched the room the way people watch rooms when they're used to knowing everything that's happening in them, a kind of relaxed vigilance, and twice I caught his gaze tracking to me specifically, across the distance of the restaurant floor, before moving on. The second time, I held it for just a moment too long before looking away. He stayed until 11. Tipped cash, an amount that made me stand at the service station for a full 10 seconds just holding the bills. Not obscene. Not insulting in that transactional way that some men use money. Just deeply, quietly generous. The way people are generous when they're not trying to make a point about it. There was a folded note with it. I opened it after he'd gone. "You didn't call." And below that, nothing else. He came back Thursday. I'd worked myself into a state of almost calm by then, the kind that requires constant maintenance and collapses the second the thing you've been almost calm about reappears. He sat at table 4 again. David had apparently designated it without discussion. And this time he arrived earlier, around 7, when the restaurant was still building toward its peak. I took his order again. Duck confit. Still water this time. He asked me one question, while I was writing it down. "Do you always work this late?" "Most nights," I said, without looking up from my notepad. "Do you walk to the train alone?" I looked up then, because the question had a weight to it that I didn't fully understand. He wasn't leaning forward. His expression hadn't changed. But the question sat in the air between us differently than small talk. "I'm fine," I said. "That's not what I asked." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. "I walk alone. I've been doing it for 6 years. I know how to take care of myself." He nodded. One slow dip of his head, the same way he'd nodded in the car. Filing it somewhere. I had the feeling that everything I said to him was going somewhere specific in his mind, catalogued and held, and I didn't know whether to find that comforting or frightening. The honest answer was probably both. He was still there at 9 when the incident happened. One of the men from the corporate table, end of quarter celebration, 6 men in expensive suits getting progressively louder as the evening wore on, had been watching me in that way certain men watch women they think aren't noticing. I'd clocked it early and managed it the way you learn to manage it in this job. Efficient, friendly, never quite making enough eye contact to invite conversation, never so cold as to create a scene. But at 9, when I was clearing the adjacent table, he stood up with his whiskey and came to lean against the partition beside me. "You're really good at this," he said, slightly slurred, confident in the way men get when they're drinking someone else's tab. "Thank you," I said. Kept moving. "No, really. You've got this whole," he gestured vaguely, "thing. You should come to our after party. We're going to the Langham, open bar." "I'm working," I said. "You get off at 11, right? Come on." He reached out and touched my arm. Not aggressive, just casual, the way men do when they've decided that the distance between themselves and another person is negotiable. "Don't be boring." I removed his hand from my arm with a steady, practiced motion and said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your table." He laughed, started to say something else, and then he stopped. I don't know exactly what he saw. I hadn't heard anything. No movement, no sound of a chair. But the man's expression shifted from drunk confidence to something closer to confusion, and then to an abrupt, almost reflexive sobriety. The way people look when they suddenly become aware that the situation has changed in a way they don't fully understand. His eyes moved to a point just over my shoulder, stayed there for 2 seconds, and then he said, "Sorry," very quietly, and walked back to his table without another word. I turned around. Kyungsoo was standing 4 feet behind me. He hadn't said anything. He was just standing there, hands relaxed at his sides, jacket back on, and the expression on his face was so completely neutral that it almost looked like nothing. Except that the space around him had changed. Every member of his security, who I'd registered vaguely throughout the evening as 2 quiet men near the entrance, had repositioned without sound. The restaurant had developed a subtle new atmosphere, the way a room changes temperature when a window opens somewhere. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I didn't do anything," he said. And technically he was right. He hadn't moved toward the man, hadn't spoken, hadn't touched anyone or raised his voice or made a single threatening gesture. But the man was back at his table, sitting very straight, and the group had gone noticeably quieter. "Still," I said. "You handled it," he said. I only stood up. I studied his face for a moment, looking for something to push against. Arrogance, satisfaction, the particular smugness of men who intervene in situations no one asked them to. And I didn't find it. What I found instead was something quieter. something that didn't have a simple name. "Thank you," I said finally. Begrudging, maybe, but real. He returned to his table without another word. When I brought his check at 10:40, he was already standing to leave. "You walked 4 blocks alone last Thursday," he said, quietly, matter of fact. "A man followed you for half of the second block. He turned off before the station." The cold moved through me slowly, top to bottom. "How do you know that?" I asked. He didn't answer. He left 2 folded bills on the table, picked up his jacket, and walked toward the door. One of his men held it open. At the threshold, he paused, just briefly, without turning fully back. "Call the number," he said. Then he was gone, and the restaurant felt immediately larger and somehow less safe than it had 60 seconds ago. Which made no sense, because he was the most dangerous thing in it. I called the number on a Wednesday. Not because I was in trouble. Not because something happened that forced my hand or left me without options. I called because it was 11:47 p.m., and I was standing outside Harlow's in the cold, and the second block of my walk felt different than it used to, and I hated that it felt different, and I hated even more that I was thinking about what he'd said. A man followed you for half of the second block, with the particular clarity that comes when your body remembers something your mind has been trying to file away. It rang twice. Scarlett. Not a question. He'd known it was me before I spoke, which meant the number was exclusive enough that there was only one person it could be, or he'd saved my name against my number somehow, which was its own unsettling thought. "You said to call if I needed anything," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Where are you?" "Outside work. I'm fine. I stopped, pressed my lips together, tried again. "I don't want an escort. I want you to tell me what you meant about the man on the second block." A pause. Brief, but I felt it. "He's been addressed," Kyungsoo said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." I leaned against the brick wall behind me and looked at the street. The familiar pattern of streetlights, a cab moving east, a couple walking a dog on the other side. Normal. Everything exactly as it had always been. And yet somehow I was standing in it differently than I had a week ago. "You had someone watching me," I said. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. The silence he gave me was the kind that expects you to already know the answer. And I did know, which was the problem. "I didn't ask for that," I said. "No," he agreed. "Then why?" Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had the same controlled quality it always did, but something beneath it had shifted in a way I couldn't fully articulate, like a note played at a slightly different pressure. "Because you returned something that belonged to me," he said, "without taking anything, without looking. In my experience, that is unusual enough to pay attention to." I didn't know what to do with that. I stood there in the cold with my phone pressed to my ear and my jacket pulled tight, and the city moved around me the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. And I thought about the word unusual and how much weight he'd placed on it without raising his voice at all. "I'm going to walk home now," I said. "Okay. Alone." "Okay," he said again. No argument, no pushback. Just that single word, and something about the way he said it. Calm, unhurried, like a door being left open rather than closed. Made it harder to hang up than it should have been. I hung up. I walked home. And if the second block felt less dark than it had in recent nights, I told myself it was because I knew what to look for now. Not because of anything else. He called me on Friday evening. I was at home, eating leftover pasta and watching something on my laptop that I wasn't really watching. And my phone lit up with a number I now knew by heart, even though I'd only dialed it once. I stared at it through 2 full rings before I answered. "There's something I'd like to show you," he said. "Show me." Tomorrow, if you're not working. I wasn't working Saturday. He probably already knew that, and I decided not to spend energy being unsettled by it. What is it? I asked. Something worth your time. It wasn't a satisfying answer. I told him so. I know, he said. There was almost something in his voice then. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. The ghost of it. Enough to suggest that underneath all that controlled precision, there was a person who found certain things quietly funny and rarely showed it. Come anyway. I went. Of course I went. I know how that sounds. I know what my friend Denise would say. Denise, who I'd known since community college, and who had very strong opinions about women who got into cars with dangerous strangers. But Denise wasn't standing in my kitchen on a Friday night with a card in her jacket pocket, and a question she couldn't stop turning over. He picked me up at noon in a different car this time. Still dark, still silent, but an SUV rather than the sedan, and when the door opened there were no other men inside. Just him. Which was either a gesture of trust or an indicator that he didn't need them, and I was self-aware enough to recognize that neither option was especially comforting. We drove north. He didn't explain where we were going, and I didn't ask, which I think surprised him slightly. I could tell by the way he glanced at me once, early in the drive, with an expression that recalibrated something. We ended up at a building in Lincoln Park, a wide, low-slung structure set back from the street, brick exterior, no signage. Inside, it was a gym. Not a public gym. A private training space, the kind that exists for people who have resources and reasons to stay off public records. High ceilings, good light, equipment that was expensive without being showy. There was a young woman there, 17, maybe 18. Korean American, slight, with the kind of self-conscious tension in her shoulders that comes from being watched somewhere unfamiliar. She was sitting on a bench near the door, and she stood up when Kyungsoo walked in. He said something to her in Korean. Brief, soft. She nodded. Then he looked at me. Her name is Jisoo, he said. She works at a dry cleaner on Milwaukee Avenue. 6 weeks ago, 3 men from a rival group started coming in, making her uncomfortable, following her to the bus stop. A pause. She speaks limited English. She's been afraid to talk to anyone. I looked at the girl. She was watching me with a careful, assessing expression. Not unfriendly, just cautious in the way that people are cautious when they've learned that caution is necessary. Why are you telling me this? I said. Because she needs someone to talk to who isn't connected to any of this. He said this without elaboration, without gesture, but we both understood what it meant. She needs practical help. Someone who can go with her to the police station to file a report. Someone she can call. I stared at him. You want me to help her? I'm asking if you will. Why me? He was quiet for a moment. In the clean, bright space of the gym, away from candlelight and restaurants and the charged atmosphere of the car, he looked different again. Still the same man, same stillness, same precise attention, but something slightly more visible now, like a shape emerging from water. Because you pick up things that don't belong to you and return them without taking anything, he said. And because she deserves someone like that. I looked back at Jisoo. She had her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes were moving between me and Kyungsoo, with something that might have been the first edge of hope, careful and small, the way hope is when it's been disappointed before. I sat down next to her. Hi, I said. I'm Scarlett. She looked at me. Then, slowly, she said, Hi. Her accent was thick, her voice quiet, but she didn't look away. We stayed for 2 hours. I learned that she was 19, not 17. That she'd been in Chicago for 14 months, sent by her family in Incheon to live with a distant cousin who had promptly become unavailable. That she liked architecture, had a sketchbook full of buildings she'd drawn from memory. and that the dry cleaner job was supposed to be temporary, a bridge to something else, but the something else kept not arriving. Kyungsoo sat across the room the entire time, not listening, or at least positioned so that the conversation was ours alone. He had his phone out, working through something with the focus of someone who operates in a state of permanent necessity, and he didn't interrupt once. When we stood to leave, Jisoo held my hand for a moment, both of hers around mine, and said something I didn't understand. I looked at Kyungsoo. "She says you have a kind face," he said. "She says she could tell from the beginning." I nodded at Jisoo. I couldn't think of anything adequate to say, so I just squeezed her hands before letting go. In the car on the way back, I sat with that for a while. The city moved past the window in its usual way: storefronts, traffic lights, people on sidewalks living their particular lives. And I thought about kindness and what it costs and what it's worth, and whether it's a quality or a decision, or some combination of the two that you make again and again without fully realizing you're making it. "She'll be okay," I said, not a question, more like a condition I was setting. "Yes," Kyungsoo said, "you'll make sure." "I already have." I turned to look at him. In profile, watching the road, he had a face that gave nothing away and somehow communicated everything: control, weight, something that lived underneath both of those things and didn't have a clean word attached to it yet. "Why do you do that?" I asked. "Take care of people like her." He didn't answer for a long moment. Then, "Because someone should." It was the most he'd ever said, and the fewest words he could have used, and I turned back to the window and let it settle into me without pushing at it. Because some things are true in a way that doesn't survive examination. He walked me to my door. Green door, West Cullerton. He stood at the bottom of the steps while I found my keys, and when I looked back from the threshold, he was watching me with that same quality of complete attention that had unnerved me in the car 11 days ago. It didn't unnerve me the same way now. That was its own kind of information. "Thank you," I said. "For Jisoo." "Thank you," he said, "for sitting with her." I went inside. I stood in my hallway and listened to his footsteps on the sidewalk, unhurried, deliberate, and then the sound of the car door and the near-silent engine pulling away. I was in trouble. Not the kind with consequences I could name yet. The quieter kind that moves in before you've decided to let it and rearranges things without asking. The police report took 3 visits. The first time, Jisoo and I arrived at the district station on Belmont Avenue on a Tuesday morning, and the officer at the desk was polite in the way that communicates clearly that politeness is the extent of what's available. He took notes. He explained that without specific incidents, documented threats, physical contact, a pattern with names attached, there wasn't much to open formally. He gave us a pamphlet. Jisoo held it on her lap in the cab ride back and didn't say anything, and I sat beside her and felt the particular frustration of systems that require you to already be hurt before they agree to help. The second visit, I came prepared. I'd spent 2 evenings writing down everything Jisoo had told me. Dates, times, descriptions, the specific corner where they waited for her, the words she remembered even if she hadn't fully understood them. I'd also, without fully admitting to myself why, sent a text to Kyungsoo's number. "Do you have anything more specific?" "Documented. Something I can bring in." He'd replied within 4 minutes with a single photo. A parking citation time-stamped at the exact corner Jisoo had described, on a day she'd mentioned, attached to a plate number. I didn't ask how he had it. I printed it at the library on North Avenue and brought it to the second visit. The third visit, a different officer handled us. She was thorough, unhurried, and she spoke slowly and clearly for Jisoo's benefit without being condescending about it. By the time we left, there was an open report with a case number, and 2 of the 3 men had been contacted for questioning. Outside the station, Jisoo stopped on the sidewalk and tilted her face up toward the November sky. Pale gray, the first real cold of the season settling in, and exhaled a breath so long it seemed like she'd been holding it for months. Which maybe she had. "Okay," she said quietly. To herself, or to the sky, or to both. Then she looked at me and said it again. "Okay." I took her for coffee after. A place on Clark Street with good lighting and booths that were wide enough to spread out in. And she showed me her sketchbook, building after building rendered in pencil, the particular way she captured proportion and shadow, suggesting someone who'd had real training or possessed the kind of eye that doesn't need it. The Chicago Cultural Center, the Rookery, the broad industrial bones of a warehouse near her cousin's apartment, rendered with such careful affection that it looked like a portrait. "These are extraordinary," I told her. She shook her head, but she was smiling. Careful smile, still learning to trust its own presence on her face. I texted Kyungsoo from the cab home. "Report is open. She's okay." He replied, "I know." Then, a minute later, "Thank you, Scarlett." I sat with my phone in my lap and the city scrolling past the window, and something moving through my chest that I was running out of reasonable explanations for. He was waiting outside my building when I got home. Not in the car. Standing on the sidewalk, hands in his jacket pockets, looking entirely unbothered by the cold in the way that some people are unbothered by things that inconvenience everyone else. One of his men was parked at the curb. I recognized the car, but he was alone on the sidewalk, and the sight of him there, in the ordinary context of my ordinary street, did something strange to the air around me. "You could have called," I said, stopping at the base of my steps. I was in the neighborhood. I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us pretended that was true. "Come up," I said. I don't know where it came from. I heard myself say it and felt the decision land with the particular weight of things you can't take back and aren't sure you want to. He followed me up the 2 flights without comment. My apartment was small. Living room, kitchen, a bedroom behind a door I'd closed that morning out of habit. And I was acutely aware of it in a way I hadn't been before. The specific smallness of the space. The accumulated details of a life lived without much excess. The bookshelf that was too full. The window that faced a brick wall. The good lamp in the corner that I'd carried from apartment to apartment for 4 years, because its light was exactly right. He stood in the middle of the living room and looked around with that same careful attention he brought to everything. And I went to the kitchen and put water on for coffee, because I needed something to do with my hands. "You've lived here long," he said. Not a question. 3 years. "You like it?" "I do." I leaned against the counter. "Is that surprising?" "No." He was looking at the bookshelf. "It's consistent." "With what?" He turned. "With someone who knows what she values." The water took a long time to boil. Or maybe it took the normal amount of time and the space between us was doing something unusual to my sense of duration. I made the coffee, black for him, which I somehow already knew. And we sat at my small kitchen table, and for a while we just talked. Actually talked, the way I hadn't expected from him. The way the gravity of his presence in every other context had suggested wouldn't be available. He asked about my family. I told him about my mother in Atlanta, my younger brother Marcus, who was finishing his degree at DePaul, the aunt who'd basically raised me through high school while my mother worked nights. He listened without interrupting, without performing interest, just listened, the way people do when they're actually tracking everything. I asked him how long he'd been in Chicago. 7 years, he said. He'd come from New York. Before that, Seoul. He said the city suited him. Its architecture, its particular combination of ambition and practicality. The way it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. "Like New York does?" I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. New York performs, he said. Chicago just is. I looked at him across my small kitchen table, in the good light from the corner lamp that I'd carried from apartment to apartment, and thought about how strange it was that this was happening, this specific conversation, in this specific room, with this specific person, and how none of the reasonable, careful parts of me that had been managing this situation from the beginning had been sufficient to prevent it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "The man on the second block. The one you said had been addressed." I held his gaze. "What does that mean?" "Exactly." The quality of the silence changed. "It means he won't be in that area again," Kyungsoo said. "That's not specific enough." Scarlett. My name in his mouth had its own particular weight, 2 syllables, precisely placed, like something handled carefully because of what it's worth. "He's not hurt. He's been relocated, in the operational sense. He had reasons to be elsewhere. I provided clarity about that." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "And if I asked you to be more specific than that, I would tell you that some specificity doesn't serve you." You mean you don't want me to know?" "I mean," he said slowly, "that you are a person who picks things up and returns them without taking what isn't yours. And that quality is worth protecting, including from information that would make it harder to keep." The lamp hummed quietly in the corner. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. I understood what he was saying. I didn't like it. Or I liked it in the complicated way you like things that are honest about being complicated. He was telling me there were limits to what he'd show me, and he was being transparent about the fact that the limits existed, which was its own strange form of respect. "I need you to understand something," I said. "Tell me." "I am not someone who can be managed, whatever this is." I gestured between us, because naming it felt premature, and also too accurate. "I don't fit neatly into arrangements. I have opinions. I push back. I walked into the men's restroom by mistake, and picked up a stranger's wallet, and apparently that was enough to make me visible to you. But who I am now is the same person who did that on instinct without thinking about it, and that person is inconvenient sometimes." He was very still. "I know," he said. "That doesn't bother you." "No." A pause. Something moving behind his eyes that didn't surface fully. "It's specifically the reason." I sat with that, let it exist in the room without immediately responding to it, because it deserved more than a quick answer. He left at 10. At the door, he paused in the way he sometimes did. That brief, deliberate stillness, and looked at me with an expression that was more open than anything I'd seen from him before. Not completely, not without reserve, but enough that I felt it like a shift in pressure. "I'll be at the restaurant Thursday," he said. "You don't need to announce it." "I know." The ghost of something crossed his face. I wanted to. After he left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, and the apartment felt exactly the same size it always had, and also somehow larger, the way spaces do after they've held something new and adjusted to the fact of it. I washed both coffee cups. I turned off the good lamp. I lay in bed and listened to the city outside my window, and thought about the word specifically, and how much a single word can hold when the right person uses it. I didn't sleep for a long time. But it wasn't the anxious kind of sleeplessness. It was the kind that comes when something inside you is quietly, without announcement, rearranging itself, making room. The call came on a Saturday morning, not from Kyungsoo, from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer it. But something, instinct, or the particular unease that had been sitting at the edge of my awareness for the past few days without fully announcing itself, made me pick up. It was Jisoo. Her English came out fractured and fast, the way it did when she was frightened, syllables colliding into each other, and I had to ask her twice to slow down before I could piece it together. She was at the dry cleaner. One of the men. Not the ones who'd been questioned. A different one, someone she hadn't seen before, had come in that morning. He hadn't said anything threatening. He'd just looked at her, picked up a dry-cleaned shirt that wasn't his, paid cash, and on his way out, he'd set something on the counter beside the register. A photograph of Jisoo walking with me. Outside the police station on Belmont 3 weeks ago. Clear enough that our faces were identifiable. Taken from distance, from across the street, with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting. My hand tightened on the phone. "Stay inside," I told her. "Lock the door. Don't let anyone in. I'm calling you back in 5 minutes." I hung up and called Kyungsoo. He answered on the first ring. I told him everything in under 90 seconds. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, the silence on his end lasted exactly 3 seconds. I counted, without meaning to. And then he said, "Where are you?" "Home." "Stay there. Jisoo is alone at the—" "She won't be in 4 minutes," he said. "Stay home, Scarlett. Lock your door." "Kyungsoo, please." The word came out different from everything else he'd ever said. Not commanding, not controlled. Something beneath the control, something that had more weight because of how rarely it surfaced. "Please stay inside." I locked my door. I sat on my couch with my phone in both hands, and I waited. Which is one of the hardest things to do when your mind is running every scenario simultaneously, and your body wants to be moving, doing, fixing. The compulsion my mother had named as a flaw, pulling hard at the inside of my chest. Jisoo texted me at 9:43. "Someone here, safe now." Then a minute later, a single emoji, a small yellow face, exhausted but relieved. I pressed my thumb against the screen like I could transmit something through it. Kyungsoo called at 10:15. "She's being moved," he said. "There's a place. A residential building in Wicker Park. Secure. Women only. She'll have her own room. The cousin situation is being handled separately." What does that mean? It means the cousin will understand that his negligence had consequences, and that Jisoo is no longer his responsibility or his asset. I absorbed that. And the man who came into the dry cleaner, also being handled. And the photograph. A pause. "That took organization," he said. "Someone coordinated the follow. It wasn't random." His voice had a new quality. Not anger exactly, but something that anger is made of, refined down to its most essential and therefore most dangerous form. It was directed at me, through you, because someone has been paying attention to where I spend my time. The implication of that settled over me slowly, like cold water. "I made you visible," I said. "No. Immediate, firm. They made themselves visible by coming near you. That's a different thing." Kyungsoo. Scarlett. My name again, that precise weight. "This is not your fault, and it is being addressed. But I need you to understand that for the next period of time, there will be people close to you. You won't always see them. That's intentional." I thought about saying no. I constructed the sentence in my head. "I don't want a shadow. I don't want to be managed. I told you who I am." And I held it there. And then I thought about a photograph taken from across a street. The patience of it. The message of it. "How long?" I said instead. "Until it's resolved." "And when it's resolved?" "A beat. Then you decide what you want, without any of this around it." It was the most honest thing he could have said. It was also the thing that made the tightness in my chest ease, slightly, in the place where it had been tightest. "Okay," I said. It took 11 days. I didn't know the details. Kyungsoo didn't offer them, and I didn't ask in the specific ways that would have required him to either lie to me or tell me things that crossed the line he'd described in my kitchen that night. What I knew was this. On the 4th day, 2 men were arrested in connection with an unrelated federal investigation that turned out to be very related. On the 8th day, Kyungsoo came to the restaurant and ate dinner at table 4 and watched the room with a quality of attention that was somehow different, less vigilant, more settled, like a frequency that had been running at high tension finally returning to its resting state. And on the 11th day, he called me in the afternoon. "It's done," he said. I was at the library. I'd been helping Jisoo fill out an application for a continuing education program. Architecture and design, community college level, a starting point. And I stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Everyone safe?" I asked. "Yes." "Jisoo?" "She started at the new building yesterday. She has a part-time job lined up at a firm in the Loop. Administrative, but it's the right room to be in," I said. "Yes." A pause. "You told her to apply." "She showed me her sketchbook," I said. It wasn't a hard suggestion to make. The hallway of the library was quiet, afternoon light through tall windows, the particular hushed quality of a space built for thinking. I leaned against the wall and held the phone and thought about all the distance between where this had started and where it currently was. A wallet on the edge of a sink. A wrong turn through a door. "I'd like to see you," Kyungsoo said. "Not at the restaurant." "Okay. Tomorrow, if you're free." "I'm free in the evening." "I'll pick you up at 7. He took me to dinner at a small Korean restaurant in Andersonville, not a place designed to impress, not the kind of establishment that exists to demonstrate wealth. 8 tables, paper menus, the smell of something slow-cooked drifting from the kitchen. The owner greeted Kyungsoo with a handshake that held genuine warmth, not deference. And I noticed the difference because I'd learned by now to notice those things with him. We ate. We talked. He told me things about himself I hadn't expected, that he'd wanted to study architecture before he understood what his life was going to be, which explained, in retrospect, why he'd brought up the Chicago Cultural Center when Jisoo showed me her sketchbook, that his mother was still in Seoul and he called her every Sunday, that he'd been in this particular business since he was 22, which meant nearly a decade, and that he'd spent most of that time making decisions that belonged to the category of necessary rather than chosen. "Do you still think of it that way?" I asked. "Necessary." He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "Increasingly," he said, "I think about what comes after necessary." I looked at him across the small table, in the warm light of a restaurant that didn't know how to be anything other than what it was, and I thought about the distance between who he was and who I was, all the ways that distance should have been insurmountable, all the ways it had quietly, without either of us planning it, become something else. "I need you to know something," I said. "I'm not interested in half of you, the version that gets presented in controlled conditions." I held his gaze. "If this is something, it's something real, which means I'm going to ask questions, which means you're going to have to decide how honest you can be, not just how careful." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know, that's not an answer." "I know that too." He set down his glass. "What I can tell you is that I have not been fully honest with many people in my life, because most people in my life had reasons to need me to be something specific. You don't need me to be anything." A pause, the longest one yet. That makes honesty feel less like a risk. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration. It was something truer than either of those things. A person telling you where they actually are, rather than where they think you want them to be. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said back. We walked after dinner. Chicago in late November had settled fully into winter, the cold now committed rather than threatening, and we walked along the quiet blocks of Andersonville with our shoulders close, not quite touching, and then touching. And the city did what cities do. Continued around us, indifferent and alive. holding its 1,000 simultaneous stories while we moved through ours. At my door, he stopped, looked at me with that expression I'd come to know. Open in its particular, careful way, held back just enough to let me set the pace. I reached up and put my hand against the side of his face, just for a moment. He went very still the way he went still. That complete and total stillness, except that this time it wasn't control. It was the opposite of control, someone letting themselves be still because they want to feel the thing they're feeling without moving through it. I kissed him, brief, unhurried. The kind of kiss that doesn't need to be anything more than what it is, because what it is already enough. When I pulled back, he exhaled slowly. His hand had come up at some point and was resting at my waist, light, like a question rather than a statement. "Come up," I said. He did. 3 months later, Jisoo sent me a photo from her first week of classes. She was standing outside the building, sketchbook under her arm, wearing a yellow coat that was too bright for winter, and absolutely right for her. She was smiling, fully, without the careful reservation of someone testing whether happiness would hold. And she'd written below it, "Look, this is the right room." I showed Kyungsoo the photo that evening. He looked at it for a long moment, something moving across his face that he didn't bother to conceal. And then he handed my phone back and said nothing, because some things don't need words to be understood. That night, lying in the dark with his arm across me and the city quiet outside, I thought about wallets and wrong turns and the strange, unplanned geography of how people find each other, how it's almost never the route you would have chosen, how the thing you picked up without thinking, the small, unremarkable act of returning what wasn't yours to keep, can set in motion something so far beyond what you could have predicted that looking back at the starting point feels like looking at a different life. I hadn't planned any of it, not one step. But I'd picked up the wallet. I'd gotten in the car. I'd sat down next to a girl with a sketchbook full of buildings and held her hands and stayed. And that, in the end, was the whole story. The rest was just the life that followed. Ordinary and complicated and entirely, completely ours.